Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from Matthew's 23rd chapter. Now, throughout the duration of the Messiah's ministry, his principal, although not exclusive, antagonist were the Pharisees, whose origins may be traced to the days of Ezra, and they still continue to exist as the Orthodox Jews. And they were the upholders not only of the Mosaic traditions, but their own additions to the Mosaic law. So they really took it upon themselves and their own authority, not divinely authorized, to add to the injunctions. And they were legalist and excluders, and there is an inclination and indulgence and Pharisaical tendency within perhaps every Christian. Ergo, it's incumbent that we heed the warnings. Now, the chapter proceeds. The first 12 verses are generally recognized as a warning, whereas the 12th through 36th verses are a condemnation, and the 37th through 39th are a lamentation and anticipation in advance of the impending destruction of Jerusalem, which would manifest within 4 decades of its proclamation. So the opening verse reads, "Then Yahweh spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses." So their authority as the arbitrators of Mosaic law was generally uncontested, especially at the synagogue level. Now, the Sadducees were generally reigned supreme at the temple level, but the synagogue level, the Pharisees, more often than not, were in control. "Therefore, whatever he says to you to guard, guard and do, but do not do according to their works. For they say and do not do." So his issue was not the substance or content of their teaching so much as their works and example, and their works were inconsistent with what they taught. Now, to instruct other people is all well and good, but the ultimate mark of a minister is the example they set. They can teach by doing and actions and example as opposed to dictation and speech. "For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but with their little finger they do not want to move them." So the Pharisees had the aura and air of spiritual dictators rather than true ministers. Ministers exist to alleviate the burdens of those they minister to, not to add to. And the nature of their burden was legalistic injunctions, which they added on their own authority. These were somewhat derived from the Yahweh-directed precepts as enunciated to Moses, but ultimately, in the final analysis, the work of their own invention. They took it to extremist interpretations and applications. They had books this big on what one could and could not do on the Sabbath. So they were a stickler for the minutia of the details. And a detail-oriented spirituality is not to be discouraged or condemned, but neither it is to be prioritized above the fundamental principles of true spirituality. "And they do all their works to be seen by men, and they make their phylacteries wide and lengthen the tisks of their garments." So their motive for doing good deeds was not so much the esteem and honor of Yahweh, but the praise of men. They put on airs, and they would only do their deeds publicly if they got reward and recognition. And the danger and folly of this is that it contaminates what should be a selfless act with a tinge of selfishness. And the phylacteries, now a faithful Orthodox Jew would have taken literally Deuteronomy 6:8, which was to have the inscription of that verse on a sleeve, but that was all for show. They showed comparatively little attention to heeding it as they did to parading it and advertising it. "And they love the best place at feasts and the best seats in the congregations." So they carried somewhat secular motives to sacred duties, and they coveted the honor and the esteem and the praise of men and the privileges that their superior ecclesiastical rank afforded them. "And the greetings in the marketplace, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi." Rabbis were generally instructors, or the Jewish equivalent of pastors. These were the head authorities of local synagogues, and it was a great honor to be treasured amongst the Jewish people to be a rabbi. But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Messiah, and you are all brothers. So he's essentially mandating a universal equality throughout the church. Now, the artificial emergence of a professional clergy was nowhere, strictly speaking, explicitly authorized in the New Testament, yet despite his designs, one did develop and manifest, and this is unfortunate because it goes against the grain of the revealed word. And call none on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in the heavens. Now, the Catholics, not to single them out, but they do in fact call their priest fathers, and this is an explicit contradiction of the premise of this verse. And so rabbis are Christians do not call their leaders rabbis, but they have other names, and the principle is intact or inviolate, and consistently so. And call neither be called leaders, for one is your leader, the Messiah. So any pope or priest or pastor or preacher who exalts himself at the expense of others cannot do so without usurping the Messiah's rightful prerogative. He is declared our high priest in the heavens forever, after the order of Melchizedek. We read of this in Hebrews 5 through 9. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Now, this is one of the instances where Yahshua flips the traditional order of priorities, at least according to the world, upside down. Now, we generally associate leadership with being served, but in the church, which is distinct from secular rulers, which their function and purpose is to rule men, the church exists to serve men, yet we are not immune to the influence and the contaminating one of secular attitudes, and that is to be purged and expunged from our ranks. The leaders are to be servants and not served. And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So this is a paradoxical precept. Paradox is a statement unifying two or more ostensibly contradictory principles, yet when properly explained and analyzed, the contradiction ceases to be a contradiction, and it does make sense. So in this specific instance, he who exalts himself shall be humbled. Now, there is two words in the English language derived from a similar etymological root in the Latin language. Those are humble and humiliate, or humility and humiliate. They both derive from the Latin word of humus, which roughly translates as ground or earth. So he who exalts himself will be humiliated, because the pride inevitably and invariably betrays the prideful. But yet the opposite principle, he who humbles himself shall be exalted, because the Father looks kindly on a broken heart and contrite spirit and rewards the nature of that spirit accordingly, or the possessor of that spirit. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut up the kingdom of the heavens before men. For you do not go in, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So their sin was one thing. They were denying themselves access to the blessed abode, which they allegedly came to proclaim and to teach and instruct and to evangelize and proselytize for. Yet those who followed their corrupt teachings and misapplied principles were condemning themselves to the same fate. And the responsibility of the minister is to lead others to the saving of souls, the one who can save the souls. And that is a responsibility that we who minister must take solemnly and not lightly, and treat it with the utmost respect and reverence, and do what we can to avoid the opposite of our intended mission. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you eat up widows' house, and for a show make long prayers. Because of this you shall receive greater judgment. So behind the scenes, they were now the Mosaic Law and more broadly the Old Testament demanded that the Israelites make special allowances and provisions for widows who were legally exploitable and vulnerable to exploitation, and the ones who were allegedly trusted with the guarding of the Mosaic Law seemingly took advantage of the most vulnerable people of society, for whom Yahweh's heart always carries a special concern, and they masked their unrighteous deeds often behind the scenes. They wouldn't advertise the fact, but they would advertise their excessively lengthy public prayers as a cloak and a smoke and mirror cloaking mechanisms to disguise their corrupt ways. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go about the land and sea to win one convert, and when he is won, you make him a son of hell, twofold more than yourselves. So this is ultimately a reiteration of the same principle earlier espoused, the idea being that they went through they expended extraordinary evangelical effort and energy, but it was towards a destructive end and one that defeated the purpose of their calling. And they were to lead men to heaven, but they were very much leading them to hell and themselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it does not matter, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is bound by oath. So they had reverse priorities. They coveted and esteemed and treated as more sacred the gold which was in the temple than the temple itself, and more broadly the one to whom the temple pointed. And they lightly disregarded any oaths made in the temple's name, but were very stringent and serious when that oath was made on the gold in the temple. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? So this is, they were foolish and blind. They were blind because they were foolish, and they were foolish because they were blind. And the question is rhetorical and self-evident. The temple is obviously the sanctifying element which renders any gold or earthly item which falls under its roof. It gives them its sacred aura, because gold is gold, and it's not... there's nothing about it that makes it more than what it is if it's under a temple roof. And whoever swears by the altar, it does not matter, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it is bound by oath. So the practice of making careless and casual oaths on sacred objects was endemic in ancient Israel, and Matthew treats this extensively somewhere in the range of the early 30s, verses in the early 30s in Matthew's 5th chapter. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? He then who swears by the altar swears by it and all that is upon it. So they were binding themselves, perhaps without knowing it, but they were in actuality binding themselves to the totality of the altar, whose presence and significance they lightly and casually disregarded. And he who swears by the heavens, and he who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who is dwelling in it. The one dwelling in it, it was the central location of the divine presence on earth, and was therefore not to be lightly treated or disregarded or brought into disrepute or disrespected in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Yet they were very much doing it, and he raised the bar on the nature of oaths to extend to the one in whom they claim to make the claim. And he who swears by the heavens swears by the throne of Elohim, and by him who is sitting upon it. So the throne of Elohim is identified as the heavens, the earth is his footstool, but in all territories, Yahweh's sovereign jurisdiction remains supreme, and it is therefore not to be sworn upon lightly or even at all, because it is too sacred. Now, a man of his word can be taken at his word and need not swear on any external item or force or source. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you tithe the mint and the anise and the cumin, and have neglected the weightier of the Torah, the justice and the compassion and the faith. These need to have been done, without neglecting the others. So the Pharisees were essentially guilty of majoring in the minors. They stress and overemphasize the trivial, the mundane, and the ritualistic aspects of religion to the neglect of the truly, truly important items, namely justice, mercy, and compassion, and all of the above. So we really have to implicitly get our priorities in order. Now, there is nothing wrong with tithing, but that cannot excuse or cover any other sin. Just because we obey in tithing does not exempt us from honoring the law which derives from the one to whom we tithe to. Blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. So gnat was an insect which rendered one ceremoniously unclean, and the Pharisees were in the practice of straining their water so as to avoid the unnecessary exposure to any potentially ceremoniously unclean items. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are filled with plunder and unrighteousness. So they had an external facade, they had an artificial, superficial aura of righteousness, which they advertised through their stringent observance of the externals of religion, while neglecting the internal development and the character, which ought to be the aim of true religion. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, so that the outside of them becomes clean too. So you can whitewash, or is the analogy he eventually uses, but the idea that you can clean, far better to clean the inside than the outside and neglect the inside, because what lurks underneath is comparatively ugly to the comparatively aesthetically pleasing facade, but all that glitters isn't gold, and what is underneath is often gilded. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly indeed look well, but inside are filled with dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So the tombs were often adorned with aesthetically pleasing, in any generation virtually, aesthetically pleasing adornments and sculpted figures, and really can be artistic, and yet what is underneath them is their true essence and substance, by analogy of the Pharisees, which was death and decay and rot and corruption. So you too outwardly indeed appear righteous to men, but inside you are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, man judges by the appearance, but Yahweh weighs the heart, 1 Samuel 16:7. So they may well fool the world. You can fool some of the people some of the time. You can, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time, and you can never, ever, not even once, fool Yahweh, who judges the heart and sees through the transparent facades we construct of artificial and superficial righteousness, which we often construct to mask the corruption and lawlessness and hypocrisy underneath. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monument of the righteous. This was to, as we'll read, it was to expiate their conscience, for they were heirs of the prophet killers, as even though they fancied themselves saying they would have preserved them. Now the Pharisees were distinct from the Sadducees in that they held the writings, which we recognize as canonical, of the prophets to be equally canonical and equally inspired as the laws of Moses. So they had at least some veneration for the prophets who came centuries before them, yet they were very much the heirs of the tradition of the prophet killers. And say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the blood of the prophets. That is easier said than done, especially when they were very much in the midst of conspiring to violently discard the Galilean troublemaker, who was a prophet and then some. He was not only a prophet, but the consummation of prophecy. And he was in their midst, and they were conspiring to kill them while they were basking in the hypothetical scenario that were they in their ancestors' shoes, they would not have done what they did, which is, of course, easier said than done, especially when you're murderously motivated to one who is in your midst, who the prophets alluded to. Thus you bear witness against yourself that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. So they were heirs to the same tradition of religious zeal, which prompts one to often murderous extremes. And you fill up the measure of your fathers. Serpents, brood of adders, how would you escape the judgment of hell? Now, the serpents and adders are snakes, and that's an allusion to the adversary who originally appeared to Adam and Eve in the form of a serpent, the idea being the craftiest and most cunning creature on the ground, yet they could not slither their way past the judgment of which we must face, and their destiny was declared to be damnation. Because of this, see, I send you prophets and wise men and scholars. Some of them you shall kill and impale, and some you shall flog in your congregations and persecute from city to city. So the whole entire reason that prophets were necessary in Old Testament Israel is because of the waywardness and because of the apostasy and their failure to honor their end of the covenant. The prophets were covenant enforcers who were sent at the behest of Yahweh and directed by the Spirit to speak words of condemnation for a present situation and also incidentally offer future predictions. And they were all invariably rooted in the past. Therefore, we get the three dimensions of the fourth dimension of time encapsulated in them. So that on you should come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, who you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now, the history of martyrs in scriptures spans from Abel, who was slain by his jealous brother, who offered an inferior sacrifice to Yahweh, which prompted his murderous motivation against his brother. So he was slain for the faith and therefore a martyr. And the final martyr alluded to in 2 Chronicles, which was the final narrative book in the Hebrew Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. They call it the Law, the Writings, and the Prophets. And he's alluded to, he was a priest in the time of Joash, who was murdered for issuing a stern rebuke to the nation of Israel in the temple. Truly I say to you, all this shall come upon this generation. So it's inescapable, it's ordained and authorized by the sovereign creator of and controller of time and history and humanity. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicken under her wings, but you would not. So Yahshua has a paternal affection and investment with the people of Jerusalem who rejected his paternal advances to shelter them and guard them essentially from themselves. And they wanted it their own way. They went their own way and did their own thing and ultimately discarded the one who was sent to them for their benefit. See, your house is left to you, laid to waste. That is nothing to look forward to. That is a destruction of one's residence, a future scenario to be avoided if possible, but at this point it was perhaps impossible. For I say to you, from now on, you shall by no means see me, until you say, Blessed is he who is coming in the name of Yahweh. Now, we earlier mentioned the etymological similarities and differences between humility and humiliation, and in the second chapter of the book of Philippians, at the conclusion of the incarnation hymn, we read that every tongue shall confess, and every knee shall bow, either voluntarily in this lifetime or by coercion and unable to resist by the awesomeness of his arrival. So the choices before us now and today and what we decide today will affect us throughout eternity. And that concludes today's lesson. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.